Welcome back, everybody. For this deep dive, we're going to be looking at something I think is really interesting. It's how those really early childhood memories, the ones, how those memories might actually reveal patterns in how we see the world, even as adults.
Yeah, that's right. And to help us kind of unpack this, we'll be looking at What Your Childhood Memories Say About You by Dr. Kevin Leman. He's a psychologist.
Okay, so I guess to start, I'm wondering, how do these childhood memories actually influence our behavior? It's like, do they have some secret code or something that unlocks how we act now?
Well, maybe not a literal secret code, but it's kind of close. Think about it this way. The memories we have from when we were kids, especially before we turn 8, those are like, I don't know, unfiltered snapshots of us learning about the world, how to get what we needed, that kind of thing.
So like before we learn to kind of filter things or try and fit in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they offer a really interesting look into, well, our core motivations, what drives us, and, our fears too. It's pretty raw stuff.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how does a random memory of, I don't know, like falling off my bike when I was little, how does that impact how I act as an adult?
Well, Dr. Lehman thinks that those early patterns, they kind of repeat themselves throughout our lives. He even calls it the consistency factor. And a lot of this is rooted in, well, it's rooted in psychology, like how we form schemas in our minds and attachment theory, all that kind of stuff. Basically, those early times, they create like mental frameworks, schemas, as they call them. And then we use those to look at new stuff to figure out what's going on.
So let me see if I get this. If, let's say you got criticized all the time when you were a kid,
Huh.
you might end up expecting criticism in your adult relationships too, because of that framework.
Right, exactly. And it can be, well, pretty hard to break out of those patterns because they're not conscious, like we're not even thinking about them.
So it's like we don't even know what's happening, but it's totally affecting us.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's kind of deep. But wait, is it really impossible to change these patterns, even if they're so ingrained? That seems a little, I don't know, it seems like we're stuck. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, not necessarily. Even though those early experiences have a big impact, they don't define us. Not totally, but awareness is key. Like, if we can understand how those patterns formed, then we can start to kind of question them and really make a choice, about if they're helping us or not.
So we got to notice when we're doing stuff automatically and then decide if that's what we really want to do. I like that. Okay. But how do we even start figuring out what these patterns are?
Dr. Lehman says we should start with those really vivid childhood memories, the ones that stick out. And he uses examples from his own life, like one memory where he had to dress up like a goat for something at school when he was, I think, 8. And at first it was embarrassed, but he also really loved making people laugh. And I don't know, kind of pointed to something deeper. It pointed to his love of entertaining people.
And that experience when he was little, that kind of put him on the path to becoming a psychologist and a speaker. So a silly little memory can show us something super important about our choices later on.
That's exactly it. And that's what I think is so cool about all this, exploring those early memories. They often have clues to our deepest motivations and even our fears, even if they seem totally random on the surface.
Okay, I'm seeing how this works now.
Yeah.
What about family stuff, though? Like where we fall in the birth order, like if we're the oldest or the youngest. I know Dr. Leman talks about that in his book, right?
It does, yeah. Birth order can create some, well, predictable memory themes, and they often reflect, I think, the unique stuff that comes with being the firstborn, the middle child, or the youngest.
Okay, well, let's start with the firstborns then. What kind of memories do they tend to have?
Well, their memories are usually about the pressure to, I don't know, be right,
Yeah.
Like they might remember messing up, breaking rules, or maybe even getting hurt. Anything that makes them feel like really responsible, and
Yeah.
kind of like they have to be perfect.
So a firstborn kid might remember getting in trouble for, spilling juice on the carpet way more than their younger sibling who didn't get in trouble.
Exactly. It's all about that pressure, like knowing the rules and I guess feeling those expectations. There's even an example in the book about Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Can you believe it? And he remembered even as a kid worrying about making mistakes when he played music. So that feeling of pressure, it really can stick with firstborns.
Interesting. What about the middle kids?
Yeah.
How are their memories different?
Middle children often have memories about having to negotiate, compromise, and sometimes, feeling a little overlooked. They're stuck in the middle, between the firstborn who does everything first and the youngest who gets all the attention. So they're always trying to figure out where they fit in.
So they might remember having to share a room, or fighting with their siblings for toys, or always trying to do something to stand out.
Yep, those are really common themes. Even Dr. Leman, he talks about his own brother and how his brother remembers him, the youngest, getting a new bike and how that kind of, made him feel a little left out.
That makes sense. And the youngest kids, I bet their memories are a little, what's the word, more carefree.
You got it. The youngest usually remembers parties, celebrations, and being the center of attention. It makes sense, though, right? By the time the youngest comes along, the parents are more relaxed, rules aren't as strict. Plus, they've got, like, a built-in audience with their older
So
siblings.
they probably remember, like, family get-togethers and maybe even getting away with things their older siblings couldn't.
Exactly. And Dr. Lehman even ties this to his own career, always being on stage, talking to a crowd. It kind of fits with that early experience of always being the center of attention.
So it's like our birth order kind of sets us up for how we approach the world in a way.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, these patterns aren't, set in stone, but they do offer some insights into, well, into what drives us and what we tend to do.
This is all really interesting, but before we keep going, I think we should acknowledge that not everyone has like clear or happy childhood memories,
Yeah.
you know? What about people who have experienced something traumatic or maybe just can't remember much from when they were little?
You're right. That's important. And Dr. Lehman, he talks about this in the book. He knows that some memories are hard to deal with. And he says if those memories are about really serious trauma, you should talk to a professional, like a therapist, to help you work through it.
Yeah, that's good advice. So even though looking back at those memories can be, I don't know, illuminating, we got to be careful too. Yeah, maybe get some professional help if we need it.
For sure, definitely. It's all about being kind to ourselves and understanding.
That's really important. So for those of us who can remember those early memories, what should we be looking for? Like, what's the main point here?
Dr. Lehman says we should look for themes, things that come up over and over, emotions, and even tiny little details. Even those little tiny memories that we might have forgotten can help us understand how we act today.
So it's like we're trying to put together a puzzle,
Yeah.
right? Connecting those past experiences to, well, to how we are now.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting, because once we understand those patterns, we can start making choices about how we want to move forward.
And that takes us to the next step and what Dr. Leman talks about, figuring out how those early patterns turn into different, he calls them lifestyles. But we'll get into that in the next part of our deep dive. All right, so welcome back. When we left off, we were talking about how our childhood memories can show us patterns in how we act, things like birth order and family stuff. Now I want to get into how all that shapes how we interact with the world. Dr. Leman calls them lifestyles, right?
Yeah, that's right. Dr. Lehman has like these different lifestyles, and they all kind of come from those patterns we talked about. They're not, like labels or anything, but they can help us understand why we do the things we do.
Okay, so it's more about understanding the reasons behind our actions, not like putting people in boxes.
Exactly. So, like, one of them is called the pleaser, and that often comes from, well, I think, from times when you only got approval if you did good things or behaved a certain way. So as adults, pleasers tend to put other people's needs before their own.
Hmm. So someone who, like, always tried to avoid criticism as a kid or maybe tried really hard to get praise, they might become a people pleaser as an adult.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. They might do too much at work or in their relationships, always looking for, validation from other people.
And what about the martyr? How does someone become a martyr?
Well, martyrs usually want attention and, I guess, validation, but they get it by, like, sacrificing themselves. Maybe they felt overlooked as a kid or not important, so they learn to get noticed by always putting themselves last.
So they're the ones who, like, volunteer for everything and go way above and beyond, even when nobody asks them to.
Exactly. They want people to see how much they're doing, even if it means, not taking care of themselves.
Right, I get it. Okay, now what about the controller? I have a feeling this one's going to be more common with firstborns.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you might be right about that. Controllers, they really need to be in charge. It comes from always having responsibility and needing things to be a certain way. They get, I don't know, anxious when things feel out of control.
So they're like the micromanagers at work,
Hmm.
the ones who always have to have the last word, and maybe even control little things in their personal lives.
Yep, that's them. It's all about order and predictability, even if it causes problems with, people around them.
And finally, we've got the charmer.
Oh.
That sounds, I don't know, more fun, maybe.
Haha. Well, they can be pretty fun to be around. This one usually comes from, being the youngest kid, Always the center of attention, making the family laugh, that kind of thing.
So they're the life of the party, always joking around, the ones everyone wants to hang out with.
Exactly. They love connecting with people and, I guess, getting positive feedback. They might be really good at sales or entertaining, jobs where they can really use that charm.
I'm seeing a pattern here. Okay. But are these lifestyles, are they like permanent? Can someone, change from one to another?
That's a really good question. I mean, these patterns, they're usually ingrained, but they're not like set in stone. If we're aware of them and we put in the effort, we can definitely change and find healthier ways to interact with the world.
So it's not about forgetting the past, but more like understanding it and then choosing how we want to be from now on.
Exactly. And that takes us to, I think, a really important part of what Dr. Leman talks about, what he calls the truth therapy ABCs. It's like a three-step process to deal with those patterns and choose a different way.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's A?
A is for accept. It means, recognizing that our memories, they're powerful, but they might not always be completely accurate. Like we might be holding on to a version of the past that's been, changed by time, by how we felt, or even stuff we're not even aware of.
So we got to like question what we think happened and realize that our perspective might not be the whole truth.
That's right. We might need to challenge how we see things and maybe even ask for different perspectives to really understand what went down.
Makes sense. Okay, what about B?
B is for believe. It means, having the guts to look for the truth, even when it's tough. We might have to think about painful memories, face our own flaws, or even question things we've always believed.
It's got to be hard, especially when the truth makes us question who we are or how we see things.
It can be, yeah. But Dr. Lehman has this story in his book about a woman who was going to leave her husband. But then she remembered something painful from her childhood, and she realized that that memory was affecting her whole relationship.
So she was basically like projecting her past onto her husband without even knowing it.
Exactly. And by facing that memory, by looking for the truth, she was able to break free from that pattern and, stay with her husband.
That's a powerful story. It shows how, like, dealing with those tough truths can actually help us heal and grow. Okay, so we got to accept and believe. What's C?
C is for correct. This is where things really change, It's about making choices to change how we act, to replace those old patterns with new ones, healthier ones, that fit with the life we want.
So it's not just about knowing our past. It's about using that knowledge to create a different future.
Exactly. It's about actually doing something, making small changes and celebrating those little wins along the way.
So if someone realizes, like, hey, I'm a pleaser, they might start setting boundaries, putting their own needs first, maybe saying no more often.
Exactly. It's about seeing what's not working anymore and then consciously doing something different.
I'm getting it now. This all makes so much sense. But how do we connect all this to our everyday lives? How can understanding these lifestyles and these truth therapy ABCs help us in our relationships, our jobs, even with our kids?
That's where Dr. Lehman's work becomes really practical, Like, let's say there's a couple who always fights about, I don't know, silly stuff like loading the dishwasher or folding clothes.
I think a lot of couples can relate to that, for
Yeah.
sure. So what's really going on there?
If we look at their lifestyles, we might see that the wife is a pleaser. She's always trying to avoid fighting by doing things her partner's way. And the husband. He might be a controller. He needs things to be a certain way, even with, chores.
But it's not about the dishwasher. It's about, like, their deeper needs for approval and control.
Right. And once they understand their own lifestyles, they can start talking to each other better and maybe even find ways to, solve those arguments in a healthier way.
It's like we have this secret decoder ring to understand what's going on in our relationships, What about work, though? How could this stuff help us in our careers?
Dr. Lehman says that our lifestyles can influence what jobs we choose and how we approach our work. Like someone who's a pleaser, they might be great at taking care of people, but maybe they have trouble saying no or standing up for themselves.
So knowing their lifestyle can help them figure out their strengths, but also like what they need to work on in their career.
Exactly. And someone who's a controller, they might be a really good leader, but maybe they need to, not micromanage so much.
And a charmer,
Yeah.
maybe they're awesome at sales or public relations, but they got to work on being more organized or paying attention to details.
You got it. It's about understanding how our natural tendencies can, help us and hurt us in our jobs. And of course, there's how this all affects how we parent too.
Right, parenting. So we talked about like figuring out our own stuff,
Yeah.
but how do we make sure we don't pass those, not so helpful patterns on to our kids? How do we make sure they have good memories?
That's where Dr. Leman's insights are really important. He says, making good memories for our kids, it's not about fancy vacations or buying them tons of toys.
That's good to hear, honestly. It feels like there's so much pressure these days to create these like perfect Instagram moments. It's exhausting and expensive.
It really is. What's way more important is spending quality time together, actually being present with your kids and showing them love no matter what, especially when, well, when they're not being perfect little angels.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Yeah.
Parenting is tough, and it's easy to fall back into those old habits from our own childhood.
It is, for sure. Dr. Lehman talks about this one time. His daughter accidentally deleted something important on his computer.
Uh-oh. Every parent's worst nightmare, especially for someone like Dr. Leman, who needs those files for his work.
Yeah, and his daughter was like totally freaked out. She thought he was going to lose it. But instead of yelling or getting mad, you know what he did. He hugged her and told her he loved her no matter what.
Wow, that's amazing. I bet she remembers that way more than any lecture about backing up her files. But I'm curious, how do you balance being that understanding with, teaching kids about consequences, especially when, like, their actions actually affect things in the real world?
That's a good point. And Dr. Lemon says it's about communication, and setting boundaries. It doesn't mean letting kids get away with anything. It's about giving them a safe space to mess up and learn.
So it's like finding that balance between, unconditional love and guidance, between grace and accountability.
That's it. And that's hard for every parent. But it's
Hmm.
in those moments, those times when we connect with our kids, when we show them empathy and forgiveness, that's when we create the best memories for them, the ones that really stick.
All of this is so insightful, and I'm sure our listeners are learning a lot. But before we wrap up this part, I want to go back to something mentioned before, about people who have trouble remembering their childhood. Can they still get something out of this?
Definitely. Dr. Lehman says it's normal to draw a blank when you're trying to remember those early years. He even compares it to remembering appointments. If you can't remember a meeting a few hours later, how can we expect to remember a scraped knee from 30 years ago?
Okay, good. That makes me feel better. I've been trying to remember some things from my childhood, and I was starting to worry that I was missing something important. So what does he suggest for those of us who, have a little trouble with memory?
Well, he says, first of all, don't stress about it. Just relax and let those memories come naturally. It might happen when you least expect it, when you're looking at old pictures or visiting a place you went to as a kid.
Like those times when you smell something or hear a certain sound, and it takes you right back to a memory. Like smelling your grandma's perfume, and suddenly you're in her living room again.
Exactly. Dr. Lehman says that even those little tiny memories can be important. The key is to pay attention to the details and especially, how you felt in those
Right,
memories.
because like we said, it's those emotions that really make those experiences stick in our minds. But what if some of those memories are, painful or scary? How do we deal with those?
Well, that's when it's even more important to be kind to ourselves and maybe even get some help from a therapist. Dr. Lehman says some memories are really hard to face, and it's important to have support if those memories are causing you problems.
So whether your memories are fuzzy or funny or, tough to deal with, the main thing is to be curious and kind to yourself because they can teach you a lot about who you are. But it's not just about dwelling on the past, right? Dr. Lemon says this is all about building a better future.
Exactly. It's about using what we learn to make good choices, have better relationships, feel good about our jobs, and raise our kids with more, intention and empathy.
In the next part, the last part of our deep dive, we're going to talk more about that stuff and about Dr. Lehman's own experiences and how he used all this in his own life. So stay tuned. Okay, so welcome back. We've been talking a lot about Dr. Lehman's ideas, about how those childhood memories can shape us and even show us a way to be more self-aware. Now I want to know, did Dr. Lehman, did he actually use all this in his own life?
Oh, he totally did. And some of the best examples come from his own stories. He talks about his mom a lot and how she was kind of like his first truth therapist.
That's interesting. What was she like?
They were super close. Dr. Lehman says he could talk to his mom about anything. She just, made him feel safe to be himself, even when, as he puts it, he was being a complete goofball as a kid.
Sounds like she was all about that unconditional love and acceptance like he talks about.
Yeah, for sure. And He tells this really touching story about going back to his childhood home after his mom had passed away.
I can't imagine how hard that must have been.
Yeah. So he's driving by this creek where he used to fish as a kid, and he sees this like mom and son fishing in the exact same spot. It was like seeing himself, way back then.
Wow, that's like a full circle moment.
Yeah, and Dr. Lehman, he felt like he had to stop and give the woman a copy of his book. And as he's doing it, he realizes that his mom, she gave him this amazing gift. Those memories of their time together by the creek, memories that stuck with him all his life.
It's like those everyday moments. Sometimes they're the most special ones, right? But I don't know, I'm thinking, what about people whose parents weren't like that? What about people who didn't have that kind of, support growing up?
Yeah, that's a big question. And Dr. Lehman knows that not everyone has those good experiences. But he also says it's never too late to make new positive memories for ourselves and for our kids.
So even though we can't change what happened, we can choose how we move forward, how we parent, and how we make our own memories.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of, I think, his most important messages. Live in a life full of love and grace and truth.
Yeah, and not just any truth, right? The kind of truth that, like, sets us free from all that baggage we might be carrying from the past.
That's it. It's about being honest with ourselves about our past and forgiving ourselves and others, and then choosing to make a different future, one that's true to who we are.
Sounds like it takes a lot of courage and kindness and, I guess, just accepting that we're all human, with all our flaws.
It does. But like Dr. Lemon says, we all have the power to change our stories and create something new, full of love and connection, something that'll last for generations.
This has been such an amazing conversation. We talked about how our childhood memories can show us patterns in how we act, how they influence our lifestyles, and even how we parent. But in the end, it's all about using this knowledge to create a life that's more fulfilling and authentic, right?
Yeah, that's what it's all about. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is remembering that our past doesn't have to control us. Even though those early experiences are powerful, we can always make different choices, change those old stories, and create something new and better for ourselves.
So what new stories are you going to create? What memories will you make today, tomorrow, even years from now? We hope this deep dive has given you something to think about and maybe even inspired you to start your own journey of self-discovery. Thanks for listening.